Hello everyone, and welcome to another video in our puzzle solving series. And in this video we are going to venture into the depths of the unknown. We are going to try our hand on puzzles that are even more complex than the puzzles we solved in the last video. As you can see, I have set the rating range of these puzzles to be 2500 to 2900. So we are going to be solving not just advanced level puzzles, but really what I would call master level puzzles. Puzzles that you should be doing if your rating is, I would say, over 2,000. Now, do not be scared by the number 2,900. These puzzles are still doable. And as with the previous videos, I'm going to try my very, very best to explain the solving process. Some of them I might even get wrong because some of these problems really do get challenging. So if you're ready to accompany me on the journey, please stay. And once again, I'll be trying to share general pieces of advice. And if you are newer to chess, I would highly recommend having a board with you so you can actually follow the variations. There will definitely be long and convoluted lines here, but that's part of the fun. Okay, let's jump right in. Okay, so first position, we have an interesting situation. Now, white is down a piece. We've got two bishops. Black's got two bishops, and black is a knight. We are actually in check. I kind of like problems where you start by being in check. And, well, we're going to have to respond to the check regardless of what else we observe. But let's have a quick look at the whole board just to see what we're dealing with here. I think that white's only big asset is this big attack down the H file. So hypothetically, if we could deal with the threats on our king, black might have a very hard time stopping simply the threat of queen takes h7 checkmate. That pawn on h7 really can't be defended easily. Black can play knight f6, but then you would presumably just take the knight with a pawn. So the win condition here seems to be dealing with this check and trying to keep our king in one piece. So the question is, do we go king a1, do we go king c1, or do we sacrifice our bishop for the pawn? Well, I think bishop takes c2 can be ruled out immediately. Because then, after queen takes c2 check, the king moves aside, and that queen can travel from c2 to g6, take that pawn, and defend against any possible threats. Okay, the natural move is king a1. But what worries me about that move is that after black takes on d1, we have to take back with our rook, and that means our queen and our rook are no longer doubled on the h file. Black can simply play f takes g6 and defend against all the threats on the queen side. So on the king side. So we have to keep our rook on h1, and I think that means we have to go king c1, because after c takes d1, king takes d1, black doesn't have any good checks, and white has succeeded in keeping both of our pieces on the h file. So pretty sure it's king c1. Chess.com has a pretty good sense of humor. They make a bishop, but that doesn't change anything. We still want to take it. Okay, and that's it. Queen c1 check. That's obviously just a way to prolong the game. Bishop takes c1. 2700, problem solved. This is one of those puzzles that doesn't test your ability to calculate far, but rather your ability to find a counterintuitive move. Because who wants to put the king right under the shadow of the queen and the rook? And yet if you know what you're doing, if you know that the goal is to leave the rook on h1 at all costs, then the puzzle becomes pretty easy. Because there's just no other choice. Okay, so moving on. We've got another puzzle here with white to move. Okay, so it looks like white is quite clearly, I would say, hunting for checkmate. And we're down a piece, but we've got three major pieces all in very close proximity to black's king. So at first sight, it may seem that queen g5 just leads to a simple ladder mate. The king steps onto the h file, and then the rook comes out to h6 or h4 with mate. But it's always a red flag if you're solving these complex problems and you think the solution is elementary. You should always stop and think twice. And indeed, after queen g5 check, if you look carefully, you'll see that black has knight g6 covering the check when black's king is entirely unscathed. So it appears that we need to look at other ways to approach the black king. Okay, so one logical step we might take is say, well, if the knight is gone from the board, then queen g5 check would work. Unfortunately, that kind of logic only goes so far, because if you take the knight with the rook, then black recaptures with the rook, and the initial position where you had a check on g5 is no longer applicable. Queen g5 is obviously absurd. The rook just takes it, and you can give a check on h6, but then the king steps back to g8. So taking the knight with the rook, the medicine is kind of worse than the cure. The medicine is kind of worse than the disease there. So are there any other checks? We ruled out queen g5 and rook takes e5. Well, that really only leaves queen h6 check. So what happens after queen h6, king g8? Well, one thing we can observe in that resulting position is that we kind of have to play with checks, because black is threatening a back rank check of his own, followed by queen g1, and I think allowing that would, is very unfeasible. I feel like white's king would get checkmated there. So after queen h6, king g8, it makes sense to look at other checks. Okay, so there's rook g4, but then simply knight takes g4. There's queen g5, so queen h6, king g8, and now queen g5. How have the circumstances changed as a result of the black king being on g8 rather than g7? Well, if you look carefully, you'll see that after black blocks with the knight on g6, we can actually capture that knight with our rook, because black's king is no longer controlling the g6 square. So after queen h6, king g8, queen g5, knight g6, rook takes g6, f takes g6, white is able to take that pawn with the queen, force the king into the corner, and now we still have one of our rooks remaining, which can swing to h4. That's not strictly speaking checkmate. Black can still block with his rook, but after rook takes h5, black is going to have to give up the queen, and white is going to have an extra queen for a rook. So I think the key here is to start with this check on h6, force the king back, and then return to g5 with a devastating attack. Boom, boom. Now we capture the knight. This is the main difference. Queen takes g6. This is a relatively straightforward problem. What do we learn from it? Well, one of the keys to solving these tactical puzzles is to understand that just because a move doesn't work under one set of circumstances doesn't mean it doesn't work under another. So if you've ruled out a move like queen g5, what you shouldn't do is kind of make a mental note to yourself and say queen g5 never works. Because in chess, the smallest difference, a repositioning of the opposing king, for example, as we have here, is going to radically change the sort of set of circumstances, and you have to revisit moves all the time. Move doesn't work in one position, you give a preliminary check, and you look at that move again. Maybe something has changed, and you don't even have to necessarily understand what has changed. If you simply expose yourself to that position, you might kind of get lucky and figure it out. Okay, so interesting problem here. This is an opening. White has just captured a rook on a8, but very clearly we have two pieces aimed at f2, so we can take that pawn. Now, what do we want to take it with? This is a clear decision-making exercise, queen or bishop. Now, neither of those moves is immediate checkmate, because after, let's say, queen takes f2, white goes king up to d2. And I think in order to solve this exercise, it really helps to know mating patterns. And mating patterns can be worked on. You can work on them on chess.com. Without a good knowledge of mating patterns, basic mating patterns, it can be a little bit overwhelming to consider all of the sequences of checks that you have. So I think the solution is to take with a queen, and after white plays king d2, to drop the queen back to f4 with check. There's a twofold idea. If the king keeps walking up to c3, you've got this common idea, queen b4 checkmate. And if the king walks back to e1, then the reason we have put our queen on f4 is so that it controls the d2 escape square. Then we drop our bishop on f2, and that is actually mate, because the d2 square is controlled. Now, can we start with bishop takes f2, and after king d2, then go queen f4? Well, the answer to that is no. I don't think so, at least. The reason is because the king escapes to c3. And that b4 square, which was a potential mating square, is no longer under the control of the bishop, because the bishop is now on f2. So in a certain sense, bishop takes f2 prematurely commits the placement of the bishop we want to take with the queen, go queen f4 check, and depending on where the king goes, either the bishop does the heavy lifting or the queen. Okay, e3, one last string call. we need to be very careful here, actually, because if we take with a bishop, then white goes king c3, and we're stuck with a familiar problem. There's no queen b4 mate. But if we take with the queen, and the king goes up to c3, aha, and that's the key. We take with the queen, the king goes up to c3. We drop the queen back to d4 with check. Okay, essentially what I want is to get the same position just without this pawn on e3. So queen takes e3, king c3, queen d4, queen d4. Now, if king b3, then we still have this mating square on p4. If the king goes back to d2, then all we need to do is go back to f4. That is the golden square. We get the same position as we have now without the pawn being on e3. And white doesn't have any more pieces or pawns to put in black's way. It's going to be checkmate. Boom, boom, back to f4, and king e1, queen f2 is finally made. That was a really pretty puzzle. I really, really like that puzzle because it helps you work on your understanding of chess geometry and mating patterns, and those kinds of things really often need to be worked on with brute force. You solve 100 of these problems and you start identifying these mating patterns more easily. Okay, let's see if we can squeeze in 2 more. First position. Okay, so it's taking me a second to adjust my eyes to this. Black is technically up in exchange in return for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pawns. Now that situation arises exceedingly seldom in real chess. You normally do not get 7 pawns as compensation for the exchange. It's very rare for one side to have 7 pawns and the other side to have none. But that doesn't really matter. Let's try to solve the puzzle. Now, it's crazy to imagine that black can win this game. The only thing that I really notice is that white's king is confined to the corner. So the first try that we could attempt here is king g3. And that would create a very powerful checkmate threat on e1. White's king is unable to escape the corner in time. White's rook is unable to assist in the defense. So is that it? Is king g3 the solution? Well, no. White can block the e-file with the move bishop e4. You should always consider these moves that kind of block the file. Bishop e4. And this rook has been essentially incapacitated. But how has bishop e4 changed the position? Well, it's opened up the other rook. So what we could try here is king g3, bishop e4, rook takes f7. And that renews the mate threat. Now it threatens mate on f1. The problem there is that white can go king g1, defends the f1 square, and all of the avenues toward white's king have essentially been closed down in that position. So is there anything that we could do? Is there any way that we could alter the position? Well, let's think. King g3, bishop e4. What we normally want to do is follow the advice I shared in the previous video, which is go back to the last moment at which you had a choice. I think a lot of people would reject king g3, but that might not be the problem. Maybe it's just that we're not seeing the correct approach after bishop e4. So I think the target position is one where one of the rooks threatens a mate on the back rank. So king g3, bishop e4. The only reason that rook takes f7 doesn't work is not because the idea is wrong. It's because this is the worst square to try to get to because it's the only square that can be protected by white's king. So after king g3, bishop e4, if there is a way for one of these rooks to threaten checkmate on any other square, white would have no way to defend because the rook is sort of locked in by white's own pawn. So king g3, bishop e4, can we open any new files? Well, what about rook takes e4? That comes to mind. Maybe we can sacrifice one of the rooks in order to open the d file. Pawn takes e4 is forced. And what if we then bring the other rook over to d8? And even though we are down 7 pawns, we're threatening checkmate on d1. And in that case, I don't believe that white has the capacity to stop it. White can actually go b8 equals queen check, because that king's going to be on g3. But even that doesn't help, because black takes that with the rook. And then we're threatening rook b1 checkmate, and white's rook is still incapable of doing anything about it because the bishop is now gone from the board. And I think that that's the solution. We start with king g3. Now we play the brazen rook takes e4, sacrificing an exchange when we're down 7 pawns. But the idea was to open the d file. Okay, again, b8 equals bishop. We've seen that twice now. They under promote to a bishop. Rook takes b8, rook b7. This is all fluff. We don't even care if white promotes to a queen, because none of these squares are defended twice. If there was, let's say, a knight on e3, then after rook takes b7, f8 queen, rook b1, white would be able to block with a knight or block with a queen. So here it's important to establish that no such move is possible. We take the queen, problem solved. Okay, I think this one's going to be... actually, it's only been 15 minutes, so we can probably fit a couple more exercises in. All right, I think this one's actually very straightforward. It's just a matter of not going for the initially tempting move and just, approaching this logically. Now, it's a situation where both queens are hanging. Black's queen is under fire, as is white. So we could, if we want to, take white's queen here. And what would happen then? Well, if we take white's queen, white takes our queen, we recapture that pawn. And what's the pawn count? White's got 5 pawns, and I think black has 7. Okay, so black is going to be up 2 pawns in that situation, but it's not the end of the story. After knight takes h5, gf, knight takes f6, white can throw in a check on e7, and then white can recapture that pawn on c6, slicing the material lead down to 1 pawn. Not that impressive, right? So, as I've shared before, any situation where you have both queens hanging, what you need to look for are 2 types of moves. The first is whether you can move your queen away with check, the logic being that while your opponent has to respond to that check, on the next move you essentially take your opponent's queen. The second type of move, barring, there's no check, is a desperado sacrifice. And a desperado just means you have a situation where you're going to lose your queen anyway. So you might as well give up your queen for as much as you can get. All right? So in this situation, if we could take something out with our queen, and then on the next move take white's queen, then we would end up, let's say, up a piece or up whatever it is we took with our queen. Is that possible here? Well, we can't really take the pawn. That doesn't make sense, because then our opponent's queen escapes being attacked. The funny thing is we could take the pawn and then go knight h3 and recover the queen, but that's not that impressive, again, because of knight e7. Black actually gets checkmated there. So, but what about queen takes f5? I think we can just take the knight, and if white takes back, then we take white's queen, and we're going to be up a knight. And after queen takes f5, if white moves the queen, then we move our queen, and we're up a piece. Queen takes f5, knight takes h5. Easy. Okay, moving right along. All right, so we've got another endgame here. And not a lot of pieces have been left on the board. Queen, bishop, and pawn against queen, knight, and pawn. Now, what do I notice immediately about the nature of the passed pawns? Well, I notice that black's passed pawn is blockaded by the king. It's not going anywhere. White's pawn is what's called an outside passed pawn. It's literally as far removed as possible from black's king, which means that if we transition into a pawn endgame, it is very likely that black is going to be unable to catch this pawn. So that could be an early target. Can we force a transition into some sort of a pawn endgame? Well, why would I think that we'd be able to do that? Well, I noticed that the king and the knight are aligned on the same diagonal, and yes, we do have a dark squared bishop. So the move bishop d4 immediately comes to mind. But in an endgame like this, you always have to watch your own king. A move that's not a check may allow your opponent to take over the initiative, and that's what happens here. Queen d4, bishop d4, there's queen a3 check, and at the very least, black has a very annoying series of checks. But if you look even further, you'll see that after king drops back to c2, black can simply go queen d3 check, and that's a fork against the king and the bishop. Black is just winning. But bishop d4 is not the only way that I see of inducing a transition to an endgame. What we can do is we can do this in a slightly fancier way. We can take on e5 first, and after queen takes e5, then we can go bishop d4, re-skewering black's queen and king. Okay, now is that the end of the story? Takes, bishop d4. We are going to get our desired pawn endgame. But the one thing we have to check is whether black's king will be able to catch the pawn. Now, after queen takes e5, bishop d4, black is best served to immediately bring the king to f6, trying not to waste any tempi giving up the queen in an undesirable way. So after king f6, queen takes e5, queen takes e5, bishop d4, king f6. Okay, we take black's queen, king takes e5. Let's calculate. a5, king d6, a6, king c7, a7, king b7. Oh no, black catches the pawn. So in that line, black was able to catch the pawn, and black will make a draw. Queen takes e5, queen takes e5, bishop d4, king f6. Here I have to introduce one very important trick, which is that sometimes people rush to take a pinned piece. As long as you are pinning that piece, whether it's a queen or a giraffe or a zebra or whatever it is, you don't technically have to take the piece until your opponent has physically escaped the pin or attacked the piece that's doing the pinning, neither of which is the case here. So we can actually streamline the process. After takes, bishop d4, king f6, we could go a5 first. And only after king e6 do we take black's queen, essentially forcing black to waste another move, taking that bishop with the king, going in the wrong direction, and then we're able to promote the pawn. We have the extra tempo that we need. We go a6, and the pawn promotes. So I think we can safely go for queen takes e5, as long as we don't take the queen. We go a5 here. a5, bishop e5. Okay, so this is interesting. Black is heading toward the corner anyway, using the very important rule, and I think a lot of you watching the video are probably familiar with this. If you have a bishop and you have a corner pawn, but the promotion square is opposite to the color of the bishop, that is a draw, provided that black can get the king in the general vicinity of the corner. Okay, that was a mouthful, but you can find that and you can find videos about it. I might talk about that separately. The long story short is, if for example white takes on c4 with the king, and black goes king c6 and then king b7, that is an unwinnable position. It will be impossible to get the king out of the corner. So does that mean this position is drawn? Well, no. What we have to do is find a way at all costs to stop the black king from getting to the corner. I think it makes sense to start with a6, right? That's just a sensible move. If the king heads back to c8, then all we have to do is, let's say, just take black's pawn on c4. Black is in Zugzwang because the b8 square is covered by the bishop. The king will have to move back out toward the center, allowing the pawn to promote. Now, what about a6, king c6? That seems more logical, heading to b6. Well, can we cut the king off there? Well, we sure can. a6, king c6. We can go bishop d4. But then the king's going to double back to c7 and head to b8. And if we give a check on e5, then black plays king b6, and the king is just going to win the pawn. So let's try that again. a6, king c6, bishop d4, king c7. Aha, can we defend that b8 square in any other way? We can. And this is a familiar idea to me. You can go bishop a7. Yes, the bishop is blocking the pawn, but the point here is not to rush with pushing the pawn. The point is to bar the black king from getting to the corner. So bishop a7, and that's it. The king can neither access b8 nor b7 nor even b6. It's fully cut off from the b file. And what we do then is we just take the pawn on c4 and push black's king out with our own king. So this is what that's going to look like. Let's do it. a6, bishop d4, and bishop a7. Very pretty way to cut off the king. The puzzle ends here, but after, and I can't make moves, but after king c6, you can just follow in your head. King takes c4. King comes back to c7. We keep approaching with our king in opposition, and once the king hits c8, we go king c6, and then black has to head the other direction, king d8, and then we can move our bishop and push the pawn. That was a long puzzle, but it was a pretty easy one to observe. First, we set ourselves a goal. We want to transition the game into a pawn endgame. Why? Because we have an outside pass pawn. We think about it, we put our tactical hats on, we see queen takes e5. Then we realize that we don't need to rush because the king is still pinned. We can save a crucial tempo by going a5, and then we find a way to use our bishop to cut the king off. Pretty simple, but obviously a lot of steps. All right, let's tackle one final problem. And it's going to be one where we have two far advanced passed pawns. And black has a couple passed pawns of his own, but they seem a little bit less scary than ours. All right, so it appears to me that the goal is going to be to promote our passed pawns, right? And a logical way to start is to go a6. a6, rook a7 seems to be forced. And then it appears that we win with the move d7, distracting the rook from a7, and then we push the a pawn, and black has to give up the rook for the pawn. Is that it? Well, let's be careful. a6, rook a7, d7. Now, wait a second. Black doesn't need to take that pawn. Black can take it with the king. Black can go king e7 and then capture the pawn on his terms, where the rook remains on a7 to blockade the a pawn. So we go back to the last moment at which we had a choice. a6, rook a7. Now, this is a classic position where I think tunnel vision happens a lot. It's very easy to just focus on the two passed pawns and whether they can be pushed and not see the forest for the trees. After a6, rook a7, the b file has gotten opened. And I'm also noticing that the black king is surprisingly weak on f8. It cannot go to e7, so a back rank mate is possible if you get your rook to the back rank here. So after a6, rook a7, could we try the move rook b2? Well, that seems like a pretty scary move for black to face because rook b8 mate is threatened. And if the black king heads toward the center with king e8, then we can still give a check on b8. After king d7, the rook drops back to b7. Check, forcing the rook trade. And in that resulting position, notice how the d6 pawn is preventing the black king from approaching the other passed pawn. White wins the pawn race. And I think that's all there is to it. I think we play a7. And this is the critical position. We do not go d7. Instead, we get our rook to the open file and threaten back rank mate. And this overwhelms black's defenses. Okay, so g5. That's probably a more resilient defense than what we initially thought, which was king e8. And again, we have to be very careful. Now, we could give this check on b8, but after king g7, I feel like we've wasted a major trump card here. I think we should find a way to keep this king on f8 until we absolutely need to check it. So what could be the logic here? Well, first of all, if we could get this rook away from a7, if we could get this rook, let's say, in this position, black were to capture the pawn on a6, well, then it would be pretty easy. We would give a check on b8, the king would be forced to move away, and then we would go d7, and on the next move, d8 queen. So the question is, can we get that rook away from a7? Well, we sure can. We can go rook, whoops, not rook c7. We can go rook b7. If the rook comes back to a8, then I think we just go a7. And then we go d7. That's totally overwhelming. So after rook b7, black has to take on a6. But then we give that check on b8. After king g7, we simply push d7. The promotion is unstoppable. Black will have to give up his rook. I think the solution is rook b7. There it is. Rook b8 check, d7, and white wins. So the calculation aspect here is not that difficult. I think finding the move rook b2, seeing the bigger picture, that is very important. And remember, even though technically black doesn't have all three pawns on the back rank, black's back rank is still weak. The weak back rank can be also caused by your pieces controlling the escape squares of the king. And weak back ranks work really well with passed pawns. So you can sort of use the threat of back rank checkmate to distract your opponent's rook. And remember, you only need to promote one of your pawns, so it's important not to cling too sentimentally to both of your passers here. And those were some exercises on a very high level. Most of them were 25, 2600 range, but I think they were still sufficiently tricky. We got a couple of doozies, and I really enjoyed solving those. So I hope you enjoyed this little foray into master level exercises. Hopefully, as you were able to see, they are solvable. There's still exercises that often can be cracked with simple logic. Sometimes they are very simple, like that one where the queen had to take the knight. As long as you're familiar with a couple of semi-advanced tactical ideas, you're able to visualize the board 3-4 moves in advance, and you're able to have the patience to often resist tempting moves. That's what sometimes makes these problems as tricky as they are. You should be well equipped to try your hand even at these difficult problems. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you very soon in the next video.